we've always known that measles is airborne, and measles is enormously contagious. Okay, and COVID looks like measles. It's a round ball with spikes. Morphologically, they're very, very, very similar. So how is it that two things that look exactly the same are airborne? One is airborne, one is not. We consider tuberculosis to be airborne because it's been with us for a long time, even though it's not nearly as infectious. So we have a lot of our historical knowledge of respiratory viruses are droplet and measles and tuberculosis are airborne. It's all based on history. It's not based on evidence. But the fact of the matter is COVID behaves a lot like measles does. And so my other part of my argument is the idea of a super spreader event. Droplet transmission cannot be spread with super spreader events. That requires airborne transmission, unless you're at an orgy where everyone's really, really, really close. For a super spreader event to happen in a room, as we have seen it happen since March 2020 with that choir in Washington State, that has to have been airborne because they just weren't close enough to each other. So if we had no super spreader events, if COVID was not very contagious, I would have a hard time making that case. But it's massively contagious, far more so than droplet would actually allow us to believe. And the fact that super spreader events exist is really it. Remember, most people who get COVID give it to nobody. But some people who get COVID give it to dozens or hundreds. And that has to be airborne. That to me, that's the smoking gun right there.
Okay. So when you say airborne, do you mean actual viral particles floating through the air? Or are we talking about aerosols, which are smaller than droplets, but bigger, much bigger than the actual virus particles?
When you exhale, you exhale a lot of water vapor, and those viral particles are hitching a ride on water vapor, and those particles can be at the same time small and large, right? So you're exhaling a whole wide range, and I think it makes sense to stop talking about the difference between large droplets and aerosols. There's virus coming out in droplets, and the smaller ones float, and when the air is dry, those droplets evaporate, and what's left is that floating virus. So when you're inhaling, if you go into a room where there's COVID, you're inhaling droplets, you're inhaling aerosols, you're inhaling viral particles that have lost their droplet through evaporation. You're inhaling all of those things. And trying to draw distinctions between them, I think, misses the point. It's floating in the air and you inhale it, and respirator masks are fantastic at trapping those small particles.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we've got Colin Furness on the podcast for a second time. So Colin is an epidemiologist at the University of Toronto, and we spoke a year ago in April of 2021. It was an episode called Epidemiology 101, in which we talked about COVID and we talked about the basics of epidemiology. We talked about disinformation and misinformation. And I really wanted to bring you back because much as people are sick of COVID, it is clear that COVID is not entirely sick of us. And this is keeping on going. The problems have shifted, but there are still problems. So I'm wondering if you can start out by giving kind of an update of where we are now from your perspective. Sort of maybe locate this in time and in the cycles of COVID infection that just keep coming and coming and coming.
Sure. Well, depending on where you are, we might be in a fifth wave or a sixth wave or a seventh wave. That hasn't been even, depending, as I say, on your location. But the overall pattern is the same. And whether we have a vaccine, whether we have interventions, whether we use masks, communicable diseases, infectious diseases like this move in waves. They come, they infect lots of people, they run out of people to infect, they go away. And if you're unfortunate, they come back again. And obviously COVID has settled down into that. It is very clearly not going to go away, even with high levels of vaccination, even in areas where we have been doing really good interventions to try and maintain or control COVID. That hasn't worked very well. So we're in this stable cycle now where the waves are not entirely predictable because COVID continues to evolve, and we're doing a big Darwinian exercise now, right? We're creating a situation where sometimes we apply some evolutionary pressure to COVID and then it responds. And it responds typically by innovating or by evolving in a way that allows it to come back and infect us and to infect other animal populations too. It's a very successful virus. There's no question. So I would say in a nutshell, that's where we're at right now. We're in a situation of repeating waves.
Is it fair to say that with the gigantic numbers of infections, a gigantic number of cases, that is accelerating evolution? The way I think of it is that it's just a greater number of little experiments for the virus to run. If it's in 10 people, it can only evolve at a certain rate because it can only have 10 people to experiment in. But if it's in 1 million people, then it's got, quick math, 100,000 times more opportunities to evolve.
That's more or less correct. COVID on its own is actually a slow mutator. So if it's not very prevalent, it will not mutate very much. And so we didn't see variants of concern early in the pandemic. We just had original coronavirus for a year because we were fighting it tooth and nail in most places. And it was in the UK and South Africa and Brazil where they actually ended up having widespread COVID, really widespread COVID. That's where these variants emerged. So I think your understanding of it is actually really quite good. I guess what I would add to it is, every individual is a petri dish, right, for experimentation. Most mutations on the virus will not be useful to the virus, but a very, very small number are. And then is that given an opportunity to spread? So a variant can arise in a particular geography, and then the question is, what are we doing in order to prevent that from spreading further, or in the case of the way it really is now, doing nothing at all? And so it's a variant that shows up in one part of the world is now spreading very quickly to other parts of the world. So we are participating in that. So it's not just scale, but it's also ease of geography, ease of movement. So that's a problem. The other thing that is a little bit worse than the way you framed it is the specter of people getting infected with two different strains of COVID at the same time. And if that happens, that's particularly dangerous. No, I don't mean for the individual. I mean that if the two different strains encounter each other in the same cell, they are apt to swap genetic material. And so we did have a Deltacron mutation that showed up in the UK on exactly that basis. That was potentially worrisome, but it turned out that Deltacron was actually not that successful, not compared to Omicron. And so the last piece of this is to say that although evolution is speeding up, it doesn't change the fact that there's only going to be so many useful outcomes for the virus. So the trajectory, in a sense, is getting faster, but it's not necessarily changing. Omicron has crowded out most other variants. That's actually pretty good news because Omicron is not quite as harmful as Delta was. So things could be so much worse. And if we only have one foe, if we have Omicron and then children of Omicron, then a new vaccine, a vaccine that is targeted to Omicron could actually really help a great deal. We don't have that yet, but I'm looking forward to it later this year.
Yeah, it does really seem that the promise of vaccines, which they fulfilled a certain promise, which is to keep most people out of the hospital. They've failed at the other promise, which is to prevent infection and spread. And it's not so much that they failed, but the virus evolved around that because it is an RNA-based virus. It's a slow RNA, slowly evolving RNA virus, but that's still faster than other types of viruses. And as you mentioned, the scale of infection is just so massive right now.
It is exactly that. You're right. RNA viruses mutate faster. COVID has a gene that actually does proofreading or error checking, which is incredibly maladaptive. And we don't really want to think about what happens if COVID manages to evolve to get rid of that gene. That would be worrisome, but I'm not a virologist or an immunologist, so I'm not going to pretend to be, so I couldn't really comment on whether that's likely to happen. What we can say is that hasn't happened, and maybe it can happen. In terms of the way the virus is built, but that's its physiology. Ultimately, it does have that Achilles heel that if we can limit prevalence, we limit evolution, and if we limit evolution, we can put it back in the bottle. But we haven't had the political will, we haven't had the public health will, and even if we did in some places, we haven't had it in most places, and so that's a big problem. The world would actually have to kind of deal with this in a synchronized way, and that has not happened.
Well, let's talk a little bit about prevalence. I live in British Columbia and you live in Ontario, but we're trying to talk universally. But I kind of lost my mind when the provincial government here did two things almost simultaneously. Number one, they got rid of all non-pharmaceutical interventions. So basically got rid of mask wearing, got rid of social distancing, didn't talk about ventilation, denied the efficacy of N95 masks. So that's a bold strategy. But at the same time, they essentially got rid of all monitoring. They got rid of 99% of people's ability to get a PCR test. Mm-hmm. They shut down the website where you could self-report home tests. So at this point, we have, at least in my province, no way of telling what the real numbers are other than wastewater signals and 3 or 4 or 5 weeks later, hospitalizations. So how prevalent, I mean, right now, the numbers that I'm seeing in the United States are 110 or 120,000 new cases a day, but some people are saying that's 6 to 10 times an undercount.
It's been a boogeyman since the beginning of the pandemic to differentiate between reported cases and actual cases. And this is true for a lot of different diseases. We really can't measure influenza very well either.
Yeah.
That people who don't seek medical treatment don't get counted, and therefore we undercount. We thought at the beginning that we were undercounting by about a factor of 4. More recently, I think we're undercounting probably by about a factor of 10, and it could be higher. It's very, very hard to say. And there is, I'm actually not that concerned that we're not able to count well, because wastewater testing is an enormously useful white knight. It's been a huge innovation really in this pandemic, and we can adapt it for other diseases. So I think we're never going to stop talking about wastewater. And in Ontario, I think we've been able to forecast cases pretty well and forecast hospital burden pretty well just based on wastewater. So that is useful, but you need to be prepared to act. Wastewater is a leading indicator. That makes it very useful. In other words, wastewater goes up before you start to see a strain on the healthcare system. So if we used it as a fire alarm or a carbon monoxide alarm and said, wastewater's up, here's what's going to snap into place now for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is to bring it back down, then I think we would spend most of our time without a lot of the kinds of NPIs that we have had that a lot of people don't like. So it's some people frame it as, look, you're either wearing a mask forever or you're going to take the mask off and never wear it again. And that's a false choice. We actually could be fine most of the time if we were just strategic and careful and proactive.
Could you, I kind of jumped ahead because I'm, deep into this and assumed that people know what wastewater monitoring is, but that's not necessarily the case. Could you quickly talk about it and whether this modality of kind of keeping a finger on the pulse is available, where it's available, and how to interpret it as a layman, since governments don't really seem to be talking about it very much?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying the reason why we're reduced to wastewater testing is that it's cheap and easy. It's harder to cancel. But the strategy in BC and the strategy in Ontario, which is to say we're just not going to measure and we're not going to report, has actually been really successful at taking COVID off people's minds. And that's been extremely harmful because it creates a sense that really there's no pandemic anymore. Well, there is. The fact that we're not measuring it, that's putting our head in the sand. And so that's a problem. And that's why wastewater testing is so valuable. Essentially what it is it's a very simple idea. We get rid of virus through our feces. We poop out virus. We just do. We poop out a lot of metabolic side products and live virus and dead virus, and we poop that out, and it all gets joined together in the sewage. So we know roughly what the population is with a given sewage pipe. And if we take a sample and use extremely sensitive testing, we can find one case in a population of many thousands of people. That's findable. So that's essentially how it works. You go to the sewer, you get everyone's combined flushings, and you look for traces of virus. And it's a little more complicated in some places where you have wastewater and storm sewers joined together. You need to do correcting for that. In other words, you're going to need to adjust for rainfall levels and say, well, we've got way more water flowing through this pipe from the rain, and we want to adjust for that so that we're calculating it the amount of virus, the number of cases that we think that reflects, not based on how much rain there has been, but simply given a constant flow of sewage, how much is in that sewage.
Okay. So if I live, I don't know, in Birmingham, Alabama, do you think most people living there could access this information for Birmingham? And what if I live in, I don't know, Tupelo, or what if I live in England somewhere?
I don't actually know how much wastewater testing is going on globally, and I think it's going to vary quite a lot. Local public health units can just do it. It doesn't require a lot of money. It doesn't require a lot of technical know-how. It's a fairly straightforward thing to do. So it can be done at a guerrilla level. It doesn't have to be done by national governments. It doesn't have to be done as policy. So be it in Alabama or Salisbury, perhaps it ought to be. I mean, there's no reason not to do wastewater testing anywhere you have wastewater. Whether governments and public health authorities are doing it, I don't know. In the States, they're doing a better job of testing and measuring cases, and it may not have occurred to them that this is helpful or useful. They may simply be relying on their testing data, and if they had great testing data, then that would be quite effective too.
Okay. So it used to be that we talked about case number and that the case numbers would go up, and that 3 or 4 weeks later, we'd end up with hospitalizations going up. And a couple of weeks after that, we'd start seeing the deaths spike. So people, I think, became familiar with the idea of leading indicators, which in that case was cases, and then lagging indicators like deaths and, hospitalizations and deaths. And I think that really complicates the decision-making, because if you're relying on hospitalizations, letting alone the fact that those hospitalization numbers are often cooked somewhat to obscure to obscure caseloads. The part of the conversation that's not really been talked about, and the messaging that's, I think, very, very weak, is this whole issue of long COVID. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I now pretty much everybody knows a whole bunch of people who are suffering from long COVID. I mean, I work in a reasonably small fire department, and I can think of lots of cases of long COVID, including incredibly fit people who had to retire because they just, they're in a fog and they're totally fatigued, and they've had, some of them have had mental health issues. It's really the hidden part of all this.
I think hidden's a good word. I think denied is a really good word. Mm-hmm. And long COVID is easily deniable. Here's why. The infectious disease community, by and large, and with many notable exceptions, has not done a good job of understanding COVID and explaining it. They have framed it as a respiratory virus. And once it's no longer in the respiratory tract, the infectious diseases guy throw up their hands and say, there, the disease is done, it's over. And so we can talk about it as a mild disease because most people aren't dying from it at this point. And I think that's an enormous disservice to us, because really long COVID is the disease. This is not a respiratory virus. It's descended from a respiratory virus, but it's not. It's got a spike that allows it to latch onto the cells that we have in linings. And the big problem we have, the vulnerability, is we have linings everywhere through our cardiovascular system, through every major organ, everywhere there's lining cells. So this is a systemic disease. It goes into your vascular system. It goes into your neurological system. It goes all across your organs. And in many cases, it's present and active for months after the respiratory infection. That's something that most people don't know or are in some kind of denial over. And I think that's an enormous problem. Infectious disease leaders should be doing a better job of saying, this isn't a respiratory virus. This is systemic. And long COVID is COVID. And COVID is long COVID. So that's one problem. The other problem is that it's a syndrome. We don't have a clear diagnostic test that says, oh, you're long COVID. It's not one disease. It's a cluster of what are called sequelae or long-term effects. And it's a long list of long-term effects, because COVID goes all over your body and wreaks havoc. We can say broadly there's 3 categories or 3 types. There's autoimmune long COVID. So that has to do with inflammation, and the child hepatitis is very, very likely an autoimmune reaction where the body is persuaded to attack its own liver. And there's multiple or multi-organ inflammatory syndrome in children. And that's extraordinarily dangerous. Heart muscle swelling. These are all autoimmune responses, and there's a whole collection of them with different symptoms. That's one category. Another category is just plain old vascular, scarring and damage to the lung, to the heart, and in blood vesicles. And what we know, and we've known it since 2020, is that a large number of kids with relatively mild cases end up with biomarkers for what we call microclotting, the formation of very small clots in the outer reaches of our circulatory system. And those can move, and they can travel, and they can collect, and they can make their way to the lung or to the brain and cause enormous difficulties. At the very least, they can render your circulation system far less effective just based on blunt damage. And so when you have people who are unable to exercise, this is a big one, unable to exercise at all, and trying to exercise through it makes it worse. This is incredibly debilitating. It may be lifelong in some cases. In many cases, I think you may recover to a large degree after a few years. If you're a high performance athlete, I wouldn't expect full recovery, to be honest. That's the kind of damage that it does to your vascular system. And then the third one, which is the one I worry about the most, is neurological, we know that COVID can invade the brain. We know it does it through the optic nerve and
But it's
destroy.
called brain fog, Colin. That just means you're a little bit confused. It doesn't. That's not as nefarious sounding as brain damage. Now,
I know. It's brain. Well, so people can suffer brain fog without brain damage, right? You can be disoriented. Medication can cause that. Fevers can cause that. There's a lot of things that can cause your brain to not work very well for a short period of time, and we can call that fog. And I think you're quite right. That kind of relegates it to some sort of temporary status. Take some Tylenol, lie down, and I'm sure you'll be fine tomorrow. That's the implication of fog. But there was a study in the UK that was done a year ago. It took a while to pass peer review, and so people ignored it. But for a year, we've known that your brain ends up, in many cases, smaller in size after COVID than before. And we know this because in the UK, they went to their library of brain scans of people who'd had their brain scanned for whatever reason before COVID, and they invited them back for follow-up scans. And for all those people who'd had COVID, there was a noticeable shrinking in the size of their brain, a noticeable reduction in white matter and gray matter. And that's real. That is real. That is undeniable. That happens. That's cumulative. It doesn't grow back. People who have really elastic brains can recover quite a lot of function. Recovering your sense of smell, that happens quite routinely, not for everybody. So it's possible to recover in the same way that you can recover from a stroke. Your brain doesn't build itself back, but your brain's able to compensate for that. However, if you keep on having strokes, or let's say you keep on having brain invasive COVID, the cumulative impact, I think, could be dreadful. We don't know yet because not enough time has elapsed. Right? Some people have had multiple infections. We don't have enough to know what that's going to look like. But my guess is that we're going to see an increase in early dementia or even later onset dementia. I think we're going to see an increase in other brain-related diseases, brain wasting diseases like Parkinson's disease. I think we're going to see that. And that's going to take a few years. And of course, again, it's going to be deniable, especially if most people have had COVID. To figure out what COVID is causing or not, you need lots of people who haven't had COVID so you can compare outcomes. Yeah. The smaller that population is, the more difficult it is to be clear about what are the after effects or long-term effects of COVID. So we've got these three categories. Each of them is going to manifest in a very different way: autoimmune, vascular, and neurological. Some will recover, some will not. It's wide-ranging, and that makes it easy to deny, especially among people who insist that you need to have studies with large numbers of people in order to know anything. Studies with large numbers of people can give you very precise estimates of things, but what I could also say is what has been termed, not by me, I wish I had made it up, but the Sasquatch problem, right? You only need to produce one Sasquatch to prove Sasquatch. You don't need large numbers. So if we have someone who ends up with COVID and then their brain is smaller, if we have someone who ends up with COVID and then has autoimmune disease, we should be taking that seriously. And what we need the large end studies to do is to be able to be more precise, is to be able to characterize it more carefully. But we've made a mistake. Epistemically, we made a huge mistake saying until we have gigantic numbers of these people, we're going to pretend it's not there. That's like saying we've got a bunch of Sasquatches in the pen, but we're still not sure a Sasquatch is a thing. We're going to need a lot more. That doesn't make sense.
So the estimates for prevalence of long COVID are all over the place. I've seen 10%, I've seen 50%. I imagine it's, as you pointed out, it's a very difficult thing to study. How do we get a sense of how common this is?
Yeah, that's a really important question and a really hard one. I've seen estimates ranging from 5% to 50%. The CDC seems to have landed on 20%. Two problems with that. One is it's self-report, and different people have different bodily awareness, different thresholds of pain and awareness. And so that's an issue. Another issue is that they're so overlapping with other kinds of conditions that what they found when they did a questionnaire of people who had COVID, and they found, oh, look, a large proportion of people are reporting symptoms 3 weeks later, 2 months later, wherever you set that bar, that's going to partly determine your perceived prevalence. But also, a lot of people who never had COVID are also reporting these symptoms. headache, difficulty focusing, and so on and so forth. So that's a problem, is that you don't have very specific symptoms. They look like a lot of other kinds of conditions. And so that's enormously confounding. The worst thing, though, and I think this is the one that gives me nightmares, is you can lose all kinds of brain function and not be aware. So someone can report feeling completely fine, and then you give them cognitive tests and they fail spectacularly on some of them without ever being aware. That is not uncommon with brain damage, to simply not be aware. If you can't remember what you had for dinner last night, okay, you'll know that. But if you're unable to actually successfully plan future events, if you're unable to reconcile metaphors or analogies, if you're unable to do those sorts of things, you may not notice. You may just think the world is a little bit weird, and not actually realize there's anything wrong with you at all.
It's not me, it's you.
Exactly. So we have bad problems of definition. What is the time frame? What is the limitations of self-report? And what are all the things that people can't self-report that we really should be worried about?
Okay. Well, since we're throwing around numbers of long COVID, I think there are a couple other numbers. Initially, the numbers I was seeing in the scientific literature suggested that getting vaccinated had a very strong effect on your likelihood of getting long COVID. I'm trying to remember what the numbers were. It's something like 50%. But I think there was a recent publication in Nature which showed it was much smaller.
Yeah.
So are we coming towards a consensus here? How effective is vaccination? It's still pretty effective at keeping out of the hospital.
Yeah.
How effective is it at avoiding the neurological, immunological, and vascular effects?
So the disclaimer is there's still so much we don't know, but my simple answer to the question is vaccination seems to have a very helpful protective effect on immunological long COVID. So anything to do with autoimmune seems to be really helped. Even someone who's had COVID, who's suffering from autoimmune long COVID, who then gets vaccinated, many case reports of long COVID disappearing very rapidly after vaccination. No one knows why. We don't have a clear biological mechanism to explain that. But there have been, again, like the Sasquatch problem, too many cases to deny that something is going on there. We know with multi-organ inflammatory syndrome in children that vaccination of one shot reduces it by half, 2 shots reduces it by 90%. 90%. So that's a clear one. And to me, that right there ought to be enough to require vaccination to attend school. That should be added to the list. In Ontario, there's 9 vaccinations that you need to attend school. There is an opt-out process. You can, so no one's actually fully being forced to, but the assumption is that everyone does get those vaccinations, and we should be doing that because it's so effective. It seems to be, at least in that case, so effective against autoimmune long COVID. But I don't think vaccination is going to do nearly as much for neurological or vascular. To the extent that it prevents serious disease, it may limit it a little bit. But one thing we know about neurological and vascular long COVID is you don't have to have a serious respiratory case in order to get this. So the virus is attacking your lungs, and it's also at the same time, trying to get into your brain and getting into your blood system and wreaking havoc there. And vaccination may not do nearly as much as we would like it to do as far as those go. Omicron seems to have developed, as I say, it's a little bit less serious than Delta in terms of ICU. That's great news. Omicron's ability to reproduce in some parts of the lung is impaired, and that's the mechanism there. So that's great. And when we first learned that was last December, I lit a candle and said a prayer, even though I'm not a religious person, that maybe Omicron was not going to produce long COVID. And if Omicron was not going to produce long COVID, then it seemed to me we could declare the pandemic pretty much over. The problem is Omicron is still producing long COVID, plenty of it. And vaccination is not doing nearly enough to prevent that. But I want to be really clear with anybody. You do not want autoimmune disease where your body attacks itself. That is a very, very, very dreadful condition. It's related to things like multiple sclerosis. It's related to lupus. It's related to some really dreadful diseases. And vaccination very clearly, at least for some, if not for everybody, really helps to protect against that. So there's been a lot of criticism of the vaccine saying, well, it's barely stopping me from getting infected. That's true. but it is also, it does seem to be stopping or at least lessening the some of the damage, autoimmune damage that's going on in your body at the same time.
You mentioned multiple sclerosis, and multiple sclerosis has now been tied quite definitively to having had Epstein-Barr mono as a at some point in your life. Not everyone who has mono ends up with multiple sclerosis, but everybody who has multiple sclerosis had Epstein-Barr. So I do think that is a pretty good teaching example to say, COVID is mild. We already know there's a ton of side effects in the 2-year window. You mentioned a potential onslaught of neurological cases, Alzheimer's or dementia or Parkinson's or God knows what coming at us down the road. It seems like an incredibly risky gamble to play with the future of a very large percentage of humanity.
I would say, I mean, the one thing about Epstein-Barr is that it's what's called a retrovirus. In other words, it stays in your body forever. It goes into your cells and lives there forever. It's not the only one. Herpes is like that. Chickenpox is like that. Herpes and chickenpox don't seem to have brutal long-term effects. So we don't want to be alarmist because we're really talking about apples and oranges. But your point is a good one. Viruses can have very long-term effects. HPV can cause cervical cancer, or a certain strain of HPV is very strongly associated with cervical cancer decades later. Because it does harm. It does harm to that part of the body, and that part of the body does not fully recover, and consequently, you get that. So I don't want to say that COVID is gonna give everyone cancer. We don't obviously we haven't had the time frame to know, but we have plenty of precedent to be concerned. And the one thing about COVID that really makes me worry is that it's able to target sites all over the body. And so the potential list of long-term problems, the sudden emergence of serious hepatitis in young children could be the thin edge of a very ugly wedge. Not necessarily, but it could be. And so the precautionary principle says, if we don't know, we do not want to make guinea pigs out of ourselves. And, I've got to say, I walk by restaurants all the time and I see they're packed and I see people having a great time. And I look at it and I say, there's no way that's worth it. All those people in that restaurant have not had explained to them, have not processed what the risk is. There's no lunch or dinner that is worth that. There absolutely just isn't. And so the kind of denial that we have, and this is a politicized denial. There's no question that politicians have been, I think, doing very well from COVID denial. You manage the outbreak badly or the pandemic badly, then you convince people it doesn't exist anymore, and you end up looking like you did a pretty good job. That's dreadful. That's dreadful because it's taking people's misunderstanding and then making it worse, increasing risk and making it worse.
I definitely want to get to mitigation and what you think we should be doing and the reality of what's happening on a mitigation level, which is almost nothing. But I don't want to leave long COVID quite yet, because I did have another question for you. And that is, do we have any sense yet if I catch COVID multiple times? If I catch COVID one time and I avoid long COVID, and I'm sick for a couple of days, it's just the flu, and I get better, then I catch it again. Is there any, the initial promised by people like the subscribers of the Great Barrington Declaration, half of the guests on Joe Rogan are like, if you had COVID once, you can never catch it again. I forget if it was Robert Malone or Peter McCullough. I think it was Robert Malone, who was absolutely insistent and told the whole world you could only catch this thing once. Whoops. Now we've got people who've caught it 2, 3, 4, 5 times. I mean, I know quite a few people who've had it a second time. Does the risk of long COVID increase or decrease or stay the same with successive exposures?
So we don't, the short answer is we don't know. Okay. What we do know is you can have a mild brush with COVID, and then you can get it again and get long COVID. So in other words, the fact that you had what looked like an uncomplicated case of COVID does not mean you're somehow impervious to long COVID. So we do know that. Whether the odds are higher or not, it's really, really hard to say. To be honest, my view on this, and it's speculative, but my view on this is that everyone gets long COVID. The question is whether it's enough to be noticeable.
Mhm.
So you're going to, I think everybody gets microclotting. I think everyone gets brain tissue loss. I think everybody gets some autoimmune, but maybe your body's able to deal with it relatively easily and quickly. And it's just not noticeable. Now, again, that's speculation. But if that's true, then what we will see is a cumulative effect for everybody. And we will find out. We will find
Mhm.
out. Now, I'm not standing on the rooftops screaming the sky is falling and that multiple infections are going to doom you to disability, but it is possible. There's no question it's possible. And I would, again, prefer to live my life, and everyone who wants to hear my opinion, that you should avoid getting COVID. And if you've gotten it, you should avoid getting it again. You should really want to avoid getting it again. And for the people who will not heed that, we will find out in due course. And that due course, that could be a decade. That could be 2 decades to really get a sense of, hey, these people have had COVID 10, 15, 20 times, and now look what's happened. So that's my worry is COVID goes all over your body. We know this. It does
Yeah.
harm all over your body. We know this. Why we should think that for most people, COVID just stays in the lungs and doesn't do harm anywhere else? Again, my position is speculative, but it common sense kind of supports it. We know the virus goes everywhere. So why don't we allow ourselves to believe that that's what it's doing?
If we're going to compete with the Peter McCulloughs and the Dr. Malones and the Joe Rogans of the world, we're going to need you to be a whole lot more definitive. None of this speculation stuff. You're just going to say, this is the way it is. It's 100% proven, and then cite a whole bunch of studies. And none of this nuance, none of this we don't know yet.
Yeah.
None of this we'll find out in the future. We need you to be absolutely definite in the future, because that's reassuring to people.
Oh, I think that's a really good point, and it's why the deniers actually have an upper hand in the public imagination. Because when you can say something absolutely, a simple statement in absolute terms, like you can never get it twice, people can hear it, they can understand it, it's appealing, they can internalize it. The fact of the matter, though, is that science is about uncertainty. It is absolutely about uncertainty. And when someone claiming to advocate science tells you something with absolute certainty, especially if it's something that's incredibly new, you should be skeptical. A good scientist will say, this is what we believe. This is what the best evidence tells us. This is our theory. And we're going to continue to test that theory by collecting data. And sometimes we're going to be proven wrong, or we're going to have to change our disease model. And the problem with that is that the Joe Rogans and everybody else will point to it and say, those scientists don't know what they're talking about. They got it wrong. Well, everyone gets it wrong. The fact of the matter is, though, that science builds that in. That's part of the process. You have a theory, you test it, you refine your understanding, and slowly, through successive approximations, you arrive at something that stands up. And that's the scientific process. That's how we're working through that.
Right. So I don't think at this point you're calling for worldwide lockdowns. So if you're not calling for worldwide lockdowns, what would you like to see? What would be a reasonable approach to deal with this issue?
It's a hugely important question, because I think in the public imagination, the whole thing has been brought to either we're going to have lockdowns or we're going to do nothing at all. And there's almost nothing in between. And I think that's a terrible way to frame this. It's an appalling way to frame this. The only lockdown that made sense was the first one, because we didn't know. And we knew this was spreading fast, and we saw what happened in northern Italy and New York City, and that was real. And we didn't know and how it was spread. In fact, anything we thought was wrong, right? So that lockdown, until we could figure stuff out, that made sense. Every lockdown since has been the result of a failure to act. Every government that's locked down now is trying to blame scientists for saying they wanted lockdowns. The only time I've ever said we need to lock down is after pleading for weeks or months that we need to actually take action. We need to take action to control this. And you do a lockdown when you haven't done anything else. You do a lockdown when you have failed. So we need to put lockdowns in the rearview mirror. And I'm not talking about the economy, and I'm not talking about people's mental health, although those are really important. It's just stupid. It's stupid to do nothing and then lock everybody up. That's just, I don't have a simpler way to say it. That's really stupid. Never mind the horrible effects of lockdowns. It's just a stupid way to go. So that takes us then to your question. Well, if not lockdowns, and if not, Great Barrington, let it rip, then what do we do? I think it's very simple. We need to acknowledge that COVID is airborne. And sometimes when people hear me say that, they roll their eyes and they say, I know it's airborne. We know it's airborne. Tell us something new. Well, here's the thing. The the federal government in Canada has acknowledged COVID as airborne, but no provinces have. And once in a while, someone will say, well, I heard the medical officer of health speculate that maybe it's in the air. So they did say it's airborne. Yeah, but the thing is, you need to actually embed that in policy. You need to say, put away the hand sanitizer. Don't rely on the plexiglass, right? Plexiglass interferes with ventilation. So plexiglass can actually make the situation worse. But either way, we're bringing a knife to a gunfight. We're continuing to pretend that it's droplet spread. So the number one thing we need to do is air mitigation. And my colleague David Fisman has, coined the phrase "air is the new poop." I want to put that on a mug. I just haven't gotten around to it.
I'll buy one.
And present him with perhaps the first one off the press. What he means by that is, if you go to 19th century London when everyone was dropping dead from cholera, it's because we were dumping sewage in the same river we were taking our drinking water out of. And we didn't pay any attention to the fact that sometimes the sewage pipe was upstream from our drinking water. And once we realized how cholera was spread, we just had to move the intake pipe upriver so that we were pooping downstream and drinking upstream. And then cholera disappeared. In other words, we needed to manage our waste. And with cholera, we needed to manage our wastewater. With COVID, we need to manage our air. We're exhaling waste into the air and we need to manage it. And the way we do that is with ventilation and filtration. So every public room needs to have a carbon dioxide display. And carbon dioxide is not a problem. You can breathe as much of it as you want. Carbon dioxide is merely a proxy for how much exhaled air is in the room. So the higher it is, the more exhalation there is. Okay, so it's like a poop monitor for the air. And if it's above a certain level, that's an unsafe room. So we need to put CO2 detectors in every public room, and they need to be everywhere. They need to be ubiquitous. They need to be as ubiquitous as fire alarms are, right? Where you know where they are, they're by the door. You can read it when you go in. And if that number is too high, then you add ventilation, which is to say the replacement of air with fresh air, or filtration, which is passing air through a filter to scrub virus and other particles out of it. So those are the things that we desperately need to do. And then when we have outbreaks, we need to put on masks for a brief period of time. And we need to put on the right kind, not the blue rectangular masks, which are great for droplets, but you're breathing in and around them. We need respirator masks, which, by the way, are very comfortable, and they don't need to be expensive. And anyway, government should be paying for them. It's much cheaper to buy masks than it is to fund more ICU beds. So that's very, very simple. We need to take care of air. We need people to understand what kind of mask they need. And occasionally, when we have flare-ups, we need to put masks on people. I think for the near future, we should be having masks on airplanes. And in the United States, certainly, it's not a coincidence that when a federal judge struck down the mandate for masks on planes, within a very short period of time,
every flight attendant was sick, and thousands of flights canceled.
Yes, and cases started to go up nationwide. What we had seen prior to that is different states and different waves. I mean, New York and Florida took turns poking each other in the eye. We don't have COVID. You guys are losers, right? It went back and forth. You can get rid of your restrictions and things are fine for a while, and then the wave comes back, right? So there was a lot of different waves. What's happening in the U.S. now, as far as I can see, and I have to say I haven't studied it closely, is that it's all being synchronized now. Why? Because every domestic flight, thousands per day, is a super spreader event. So what you're actually doing is now distributing COVID as efficiently as possible across the country all at the same time. So there might be some advantages, ironically, in having the entire US on one wave, because when everyone's getting sick everywhere, there's no room to deny it. There's no room to say, hey, I'm in Florida and everything's fine right now, right? So I think that might really give us that one narrative of, wow, we're in a serious wave right now. And again, going back to the idea that we may need masks for a 2-week period or a 3-week period in order to head off this wave. Everyone's suffering in the same way. All places are experiencing it at the same time. It might be an easier sell, but we've gone 2 steps back in the United States with taking masks off airplanes. So that's my way of saying there's certain circumstances, certain situations, and I would say long-term care homes too for the foreseeable future, where we have really vulnerable people. And I have been a strong proponent of masks in schools for kids, and that's been a very divisive issue. That's been a very polarizing issue. I think the sort of hate mail and death threats I've got have been highest around air travel and schools. Those have been the two areas where people get super polarized and super angry one way or the other. But
Tucker Carlson has been riling everyone up about kids wearing schools and supposedly doing irreversible damage to children and causing trauma. I'm honestly, like, having
Yeah.
watched it here, yes, you can make your children traumatized by wearing masks if you yourself are traumatized by making them wear masks.
Yeah.
If you're there, like getting them riled up and yelling and screaming about this, yeah, they'll absorb that. Now,
Yeah.
maybe I think there's an argument for, like, I don't know, age 5 and under. Like, maybe they do need to see people's lips move to acquire decent English skills. That's an argument I've heard. If there's data, I'll buy it. But
I think if you look at the number of hours that a child is inside in a classroom, it's a very small piece of the day.
Yeah.
And those kids under 5 who aren't vaccinated are among our most vulnerable, right? So
Fair.
They're the ones who I am actually most worried about. I don't have a child under 5, and so I can't relate personally to what that's like trying to get a mask on them. But with that group, we should be doubling down on ventilation, filtration, making sure that the adults are vaccinated, going outside for lunch, right? Doing stuff outside, and that's the thing. I mean, in the old plague days, when they had no disease model in 17th century Great Britain. They did everything outside. They went outside, and Great Britain is not a tropical climate. They just did everything outside because they figured that when you do that, there's less disease spread. And of course, they were right about that. So we don't seem nearly so adaptable. We've said to teachers, well, maybe some teachers can maybe take some kids outside for lunch, maybe sometimes. That's not an effective response. But I have 2 kids. I want to be clear about this. I have 2 kids in the public school system. One is in grade 4 and one's in grade 8. They both wear respirator masks. They both come home for lunch because we're able to do that. Actually, in the case of my younger one, I go there and we have outdoor lunch. And it is inconvenient, and it is time consuming, and it is laborious, but it's also enormously safe. My kids also have sports. My kids also go to the cottage. My kids also have play dates and social engagements outside. And so they've got not a bad life in a lot of ways. I think their childhood has been dented by COVID. I don't want to be overly optimistic about it, but we found an equilibrium where they're going to schools where there's COVID and they are not catching COVID, and their mouths are covered for a small piece of the day. Really, ultimately, it's a small piece of the day, and that saves their organs and their brains, and I think it's worth it. So we talked about non-pharmaceutical interventions, right, which are non-drugs, not vaccines, not drugs, but other interventions like lockdowns, physical distancing, masks, plexiglass, hand sanitizer, as technically an NPI. These are all things that we have played with successfully or not successfully, and we have tended to use the word restrictions to describe these, especially because the elephant in the room is lockdowns, right? Lockdowns and to some extent masking or showing proof of vaccination. These feel like restrictions, and I really rail against that word restriction. They are protections. And if you don't like them, you may want to call them restrictions. But I think we really lose sight of the fact that when we do away with these things, we are being very anti-inclusive. We have to think about all the people who are immune compromised, or all the people who are close to someone who is, or who is the parent of an under 5-year-old. There are so many people who really need those protections to be safe, to be able to participate, to be able to go to school, to be able to go to work. And so I really want us to stop calling them restrictions. I want us to call them protections. And I want us to acknowledge to ourselves that when we do away with these, we are being anti-inclusive. And if as a society we do a vote and we decide that anti-inclusive is what we want to be, then that's what we'll be. But it bothers me that we do it without acknowledging it, that we marginalize these people even more. And it's incredibly unfair. So I've taken to really calling people on it when they talk about them as restrictions. It's like restriction for you, maybe. That's ableist language. Let's talk about them as being protections, and let's be really clear that we should stop making claims about inclusivity. That's all. I just want people to stop pretending to be inclusive if they're talking about doing away with restrictions, because that is an oxymoron. They're protections.
Well, you mentioned immune compromised. You mentioned parents of kids under 5. How about people who live at home with elderly parents? How about people who have cancer, whose immune system is pretty much completely destroyed some of the time?
Yeah,
And
people with diabetes, people with COPD or other kinds of lung disease or heart disease. It's a long list. If you look at people who are particularly vulnerable to COVID, it's actually a really long list. The very young, the very old, and everybody in between who's got a health condition that puts them at risk. That is a lot of people. There's no question, and none of them are in restaurants. Let's be really clear about that. None of them are. They're the ones who are not there. And so when you're going to a restaurant and saying, this is great, there's no restrictions, I love having normal life back, normal for you, life back for you, no restrictions for you, but you're not the only one here. We need to talk about everybody. And as a society, we have, I think, an obligation. As Canadians, I think we have an obligation. As North Americans, I think we have an obligation to extend some protection to people who need it, to be caring, to be inclusive. That's a really important word.
Especially in non-optional places. You could make an argument that going to the movie theaters or going to a restaurant is optional. But going on transit isn't optional. Going to the supermarket is not optional. Going to the hospital, I mean, most hospitals are pretty good from what I've seen, but that's, again, not optional. So if you want to live and die, if you want to die on the hill of, I get to go to a movie theater without a mask, okay, I think you're an idiot, but whatever. But if you're insisting on that same freedom, spelled FREEDUMB, for the supermarket or for transit, you're an idiot, because there are lots of people who cannot avoid that, who are immune compromised, who have an autoimmune condition, who have COPD, who have impaired function somewhere in their body, who have cancer, who have to take care of their elderly parents, and would rather not watch them choke to death from COVID.
Absolutely. And I mean, grocery stores are a very poignant example because everybody needs to shop for food. Everybody needs to eat. And what I have not seen are stores stepping up and saying, we're going to have a mask mandatory hours. That is a way to be inclusive, is to say, hey, these times of day, masks are required. And if you don't want to wear a mask, then you're welcome at all these other times of day. Like, that would be a reasonable way of doing that. Or, opera, symphony performances. I would go if I knew that they had some performances that were mask mandated. That would be a very useful thing to be able to do. So I think that's part of the discourse we haven't had is alternative ways to be inclusive in ways that matter. Now, you can't do that with transit, right? You can't offset people's work hours, right? So I think transit would be one of the last places where we should unmask. Same with hospitals. I mean, these are really, really obvious. But even for movie theaters, I mean, even for cultural events and other things that are not as core to living as grocery shopping, we could still be inclusive by having mask only performances, mask only hours.
Just to jump back to something you said, and I'm going to interject with something personal. You were talking about using CO2 monitors and using your CO2 concentrations as a proxy for how much fresh air there is in a room, or the lack of fresh air. And baseline is about 400 parts per million. So your little detector has got 400 if you're outside, or 405 or whatever it is. And if you take it, I mean, I have one. I have a CO2 detector. It was a couple $100 on Amazon. And I've used it, for example, at the fire hall. I used to wear a mask 100% of the time at the fire hall. But now I've found that, hey, if I open this door here and I open that window, I can watch the CO2 concentration go from 1,000 down to 400 or 420. All right, so there's a tiny bit of poop in the air. That's a risk I'm willing to take. And it's quite liberating. Okay, you take your mask off and you sit and you bullshit with the guys, and then, you get a call. Well, now I put the mask on again because we're on the truck and I haven't measured it in the truck yet. It's not a giant intervention. If you can read numbers on a little tiny screen, you can then take corrective action. I'm going to open another window. And I find this denial that COVID is airborne and the denial of the importance of ventilation and filtration absolutely baffling, because we're not asking for billions of dollars of intervention. These are open a bloody window. You will make the situation better. If you run a gym, one of the strangest things that I ever did is I went and was giving vaccinations. At a certain point, there weren't enough nurses to give vaccinations, so they were calling on firefighters to give vaccinations. So I've given, 1,000 vaccinations. they would channel everybody into this room and the doors would be closed.
Yes.
And everyone's wearing their little surgical masks. So I'd be the
Yes.
guy going around and opening all the doors. Some security guard would come around and close them. And like I'd go back and open them. It's just madness. It's such a simple mitigation. And maybe that's part. People who knew that I was going to be talking to you were like, hey, Stefan, can you ask Colin? I run a gym.
Yeah.
How can I, whether it's a jiu-jitsu gym, a weightlifting gym, or whatever, how can I be responsible about this? There's no more government funding to not stay open, and my creditors are coming, so I can't not open, but how can I do it responsibly? So let's take the worst case scenario, which I think is people breathing heavily in close proximity to one another. In the case of jiu-jitsu, at a disturbingly close range. Mm-hmm. How can we make that safer?
Yeah, I really like your point coming back to the CO2 monitor and the way that this demonstrates that we can fix air very easily. You're absolutely right. It's amazing how quickly the numbers go up when you've got people in a room with closed windows and doors, and it's amazing how fast it comes down when you add ventilation. Now, simply opening a window doesn't always work, though, and I'll say it in a couple of ways. One is, when it's minus 30 outside, that's difficult. The other is if it's a big building, what you may be doing is drawing other people's polluted air from elsewhere in the building into your room, right? It's you can open windows and you don't get any fresh air in, you're getting everyone else's stale air, right? So everyone else is getting the benefit.
Exiting out past you.
Yeah, so it can be more complicated than that, but so therefore it can start to get a bit expensive. I just think it's worth every penny. So you've got heat recovery ventilators, right, which is like opening a window. Only what you're doing is it's a fan that takes air from the outside and expels air to the outside, and the air is not intermingled, but run by with a thin membrane, so that there's heat transfer. So that cold air is warmed by the air going out, and it's relatively air efficient. New houses, by the way, are built with these. I mean, and many buildings have them. So this is something that may already be, but you need to make sure it's working, and you need to make sure it's set to maximum intake, because some building managers may turn that down or even turn it off. So you want to know what your heat recovery ventilation is. And so that can be way more sustainable and effective than just opening a window. HEPA filters, scrub air. Right. So, in your fire hall, if you open a window or do whatever you do and it comes down to 500 or 600 parts per million, I think that feels pretty safe. Add a HEPA filter and I'd take my mask off too. So I think those are ways we can do that. So those are really the two main things: is an HRV to ventilate, heat recovery ventilator, and a HEPA filter to scrub air. The third thing I would say, and it's not going to be popular with everybody, is requiring people to be vaccinated is helpful. And the reason it's helpful is not the way most people think. Yes, it makes you somewhat less likely to be infected, but that's actually not the main thing. The main thing is that if you're vaccinated, your symptoms start at the beginning of your infection. Because remember, the symptoms are caused by your body's immune system, not the disease. So your body is on it. It knows what that critter is, and it's on it. You get your symptoms fast, which means you're aware that you're sick before you're hugely contagious. That's valuable as long as the person understands that, hey, if I feel sick, I need to stay home, right?
Let's just go through that again, please. So sure. I'm unvaccinated. I'm unvaccinated and I've never had COVID. And along comes a sufficient dose of SARS-CoV-2 virus particles and I become infected. Are you saying that because it takes my body a while to ramp up, I could become infectious, but I won't yet have symptoms?
That is exactly what I'm saying. That is a major difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated. If you're vaccinated, the symptoms show up right away before you're hugely infectious. So there's a big sign on you. Your nose is running. You got a sore throat. You need to stay home. An unvaccinated person who is, let's say, is prepared to isolate. Let's say it's an unvaccinated person who's right-minded in every way and who doesn't want anyone to be sick. They're scared of needles and they want everyone to be safe. Okay, that person is way more dangerous because yes, they could be shedding all kinds of virus before they're aware they're sick. And that was how COVID spread very, very successfully in the earlier waves, that it was clearly moving asymptomatically. And so you couldn't just trust the screening questionnaire. You couldn't just trust people's sense of decency to not want to spread disease. couldn't trust it. So that's the problem being unvaccinated. Now, a number of unvaccinated people also have riskier behaviors, right? Because not being vaccinated sometimes goes along with feeling that COVID really isn't such a threat and that my body will be fine and freedom. And, there's a lot of discourse there where you shouldn't be surprised. The Venn diagram of people who are not vaccinated and the people who engage in risky behaviors, there's going to be a lot of overlap there. But my main thing, again, is not about people's morals or standards. It's simply about the biology of this. If you're vaccinated, the symptoms show up first before you're really contagious. If you're not vaccinated, it's the opposite. And so unvaccinated people are proportionately far more dangerous, not because of their attitude, but because of the biology.
Well, I'm 100% pro mandatory vaccination for public servants. And that's probably where my biggest number of my death threats and angry emails have come from. If you're on the public teat, if you're getting paid by the public purse, especially if you're a first responder, getting paid by the public to help the public's problems, you don't have the right to increase the chances that you're going to make that person's problems worse. That's
a complicated issue. Maybe we can touch on that for a moment, because I've been an expert witness on a few cases, and I've actually argued it both ways: mandatory vaccination and not. I agree with you to a point, and certainly for firefighters and police, first responders, ambulance drivers, prison guards, people for whom, if you are sick and cannot work, we're hooped. Like that's where public safety matters. Yes, I favor mandatory vaccination. I'm getting that way with healthcare workers too, simply because we're seeing what's going on with a shortage of nurses and even physicians as well. So where there's a huge public safety menace of you not being fit for work, I think mandatory vaccination is important. For everybody else, and I would include teachers in this and a number of other kinds of allied health workers and other kinds of transit drivers and post office workers. For people like that, I actually don't want people being fired for not being vaccinated. I want us to pull out every stop we can to encourage them. I want us to make life less convenient for people who aren't vaccinated. You gotta do more rapid tests and stick that thing up your nose. I think we want to make life, we want to nudge people toward vaccination, because convenience is a big thing for many people. But when you mandate it too widely, what you actually do is energize the anti-vaxxers, and that's a problem. And that's what we've done. In fact, the Freedom Convoy was triggered. I won't say it was caused, but it was triggered by a federal decision saying, truck drivers, you're going to need to be vaccinated. I would have said, truck drivers, you're going to have a 2-hour wait at the border while we PCR you at your expense, but you get to choose. And that's a really, really big difference. I did an interesting study at a cancer hospital back in when we just worried about the flu. And it was an attitude study. This was a cancer hospital where patients are very immune compromised. They couldn't get more than about 10% of the staff at the hospital to take the flu shot. And they were going to make it mandatory. And the invective, the unions got involved, and the nastiness, it was ugly. It was ugly. And so the hospital backed right off, and they said, okay, everyone calm down. No one's going to be forced to do anything. And I realize this is going to sound quaint now, but back at that time, the decision was you can either get vaccinated and get a sticker on your ID badge, or you're wearing a mask for your entire shift for the entire flu season. And you get to choose. You've got agency. So vaccination rates went up to about 95%.
That's only true if it's enforced, because I've seen other agencies, without mentioning names, where that was the policy and it was never enforced. It's worse to have a policy that's not enforced than it is to have no policy at all.
Fair. And it was a sticker on the ID badge that makes it enforceable, right? So you're absolutely right about that. But my point is not that the vaccination rate went up to 95%. That's not surprising. What's surprising is I did an attitude survey, and among those people, we said, did you get vaccinated because you didn't want to wear a mask? Or why did you not get it? And we gave people choices. Mm-hmm. Well, almost no one said, I got vaccinated because I really didn't want to, and I did anyway because I didn't want to wear a mask. No, they started to say, it's a professional responsibility. I'm protecting my family. I'm protecting myself. Mm-hmm. I'm protecting my patients. In other words, when you gave people the agency, but you made life a little bit less convenient, you got not only compliance, but you got hearts and minds as well. And that, to me, was one of the most important lessons I've learned in infection control. And so I want to be super, super careful about mandating vaccination. So for teachers, this is what I would say. Every teacher in a classroom should be vaccinated because kids are vulnerable. Every healthcare worker of any stripe needs to be vaccinated if they're caring for patients. But instead of firing them, we should reassign them. Teachers like teaching, and that's why they became teachers. And if they've been reassigned to some kind of tedious job where they don't have social contact. I don't mean a punitive job. I just mean a job where they don't have contact with vulnerable people. They might decide on their own that actually they kind of want their job.
Yeah.
Same with healthcare workers. Put them in the laundry or the kitchen or wherever else where they don't have contact with vulnerable people. Maybe they'll change their minds, but give them the choice. Wherever you can, give them the choice. And I think that would have been more successful because anti-vaccination rhetoric is extraordinarily harmful. And the more prevalent it is, the more believable it is. It's a psychological truth that if something is a reality, that if something is repeated often enough, people will start to believe it.
Yeah. Or at least they will lose any sense that there is a truth. Well,
Yes.
Maybe vaccines work, or maybe
Yes.
they're putting microchips in you. Well,
Yes.
maybe COVID is a flu, or maybe it's the worst thing ever. You can't trust anybody these days, Colin. You just can't. Therefore, I don't have any opinion at all.
Yeah.
I think the undermining of the idea of truth is maybe one of the most pernicious aspects of all this, because you have
truth and
people
expertise.
yeah.
Yeah,
You're,
expertise. And
you're an elite expert.
Yeah. I'm spending a lot of my time actually now thinking about what does this mean for ways of knowing and expertise, and how do we move forward in a post-truth world? Because my day job is at the Faculty of Information. I'm not a healthcare worker. I actually think about how people use information and knowledge. That's my day job, and so this pandemic has provided a really ghastly display of just where we can go as a society in terms of rejecting expertise in favor of, well, my cousin's hairdresser's dentist said, or social media said, or I saw a flyer that said, this is a really big problem, and it's an extraordinarily difficult problem, especially when you get a small proportion of physicians going anti-vax. And they do a great deal of harm. They do an enormous amount of harm because it only takes 1 in 10,000 MDs, and then they get lionized by the anti-vaxxers to see it's a conspiracy, and this physician is brave enough to speak out against the status quo. That's enormously harmful. So it's
what's the background rate of mental illness in society? Call it 1 in 10. Let's say that doctors are more immune because there's more screening. Call that 1 in 1,000. There's 1 million doctors, more or less, I think, in North America. So 1 in 1,000 is still a lot of people. And if you then have this entire infrastructure dedicated to giving them a platform, you're, a gastroenterologist who's now speaking about immunology. Great. Yes. Come to our big Defeat the Mandates rally here. Yes. We'll give you an escort with a bunch of pickup trucks flying a Canadian flag.
Yeah. If you find a population big enough and the population of physicians is big, as you say, you will find people who are really causing difficulties because of their ideology. We can call it mental wellness. We can call it a bunch of things. Regardless of the label, the outcome is the same, and that is really harmful.
Okay. So if I enjoy reading history. So if you read history, plagues come and go all the time. There's so many sieges in history that have been stopped when a plague went through the army, whether it's cholera or the Justinian plague or the Black Death, or in the last 20 years, we've got SARS, we've got MERS, we had the Hong Kong flu in the 50s or 60s. And so people are now looking at this and they're looking like, oh my God, we just finished with bloody COVID. We're not, of course, finished with COVID, but we're being told that COVID's done. And now you come up with monkeypox. So 2 things. 1, monkeypox, should we take it seriously? And number 2, sort of in the grander scheme, what is our response to something like monkeypox? Tell us about the next big infection that is going to jump out in nature at some point, cross a species barrier, mutate within us, and become the next horrendous plague.
You're absolutely right that plagues are a fact of life, and sometimes they come in short frequencies and sometimes long spaces between them. Monkeypox is worrisome because it's not behaving the way we expected it to behave. It's like a raccoon in your backyard that is behaving strangely. You're like, that's not normal. Like, I don't really care about raccoons, but this one's scary.
What do you mean it's not behaving the way that we expect it to behave?
Well, monkeypox is not very transmissible between humans. There was very little human transmission. And so our baseline expectation is monkeypox is no big deal. And now we're seeing, and I think it may have just been kind of a perfect storm of a couple of raves in Europe where there's a lot of close bodily contact, and then people, sexual contact mostly, and then people went off off in their own direction, right? So that's kind of a nightmarish super spreader event. And if those are promiscuous people, then they're going to be spreading it very, very quickly. I suspect that monkeypox is not going to end up becoming a really dominant thing. I think it will be controllable, but when it starts to spread like this, when we're not expecting it, we've got to say two things. One is our understanding of monkeypox may have been incorrect. And so we should be worried about that, right? We should be looking for evidence that our understanding is wrong. And it also may mean that monkeypox has evolved or changed in some way. So
isn't there some recent genetic evidence showing that the strain of monkeypox now is different from previous strains of monkeypox, that it has evolved?
Probably, I don't know firsthand. Probably that's true. And of course, there's two varietals. There's a Congo, and then there's the West Coast. And the Congo one's more dangerous. The West Coast is the one that's been spreading. All viruses mutate when you give them a population in which to inhabit, as we talked about earlier. So, if we're seeing a lot of human-human transmission, it's going to evolve, and it's going to evolve in ways that may be better or worse. By and large, viruses evolve to be more contagious and less lethal. Why? Evolutionary pressure. If you're a virus, killing your host is of no value to you at all. All you want to do is reproduce. And if your host eventually dies as a side effect of your reproduction, well, as long as you're contagious, that's okay. But all a virus wants to do is reproduce. So
that being said, though, there are viruses that have been with us for thousands of years and have not really become much less deadly. I mean, TB and smallpox would be.
I think tuberculosis. Now, I'm not a tuberculosis specialist, but I think my understanding is tuberculosis has actually gotten less severe over time.
Okay.
And what it does is it lurks in your body for a whole lifetime, right? It's people die much less from tuberculosis, even if it's not being treated, than I think they did. Syphilis used to be a lot more severe. It's attenuated, right? So it's if you're syphilis, you want your host to be out there healthy and happy enough and not looking too sick, right? You want them out there spreading the joy. So there has been that evolution. Often what happens is a pathogen will come out of the animal world, and a particular animal species has adapted to it, and it comes into the human world where we don't have an adaptation, and it kills a lot of people. And then the virus essentially says to itself, this is not working very well. We got to tone it down a little bit. We got to stop killing people so fast. I mean, it happens reflexively through natural selection, but if the virus had conscious thought, that's what it would be saying is, we're not doing this efficiently. The efficient thing is to spread and not kill. So we can hope for that with monkeypox, but the main thing we should be concerned about is this is not behaving the way we thought it would. So either our understanding is wrong, or the virus has changed, or both. That said, if you are being careful about COVID, it would be enormously difficult. It would be enormously difficult to get monkeypox, right? So we can kind of just double down and say, you know what? We're in obviously a time of pestilence, and monkeypox is much less contagious by any measure, much less contagious than COVID. And so if you're being careful, monkeypox should not be an issue.
So, I mean, the real reason I brought up monkeypox is in terms of, I would have liked 2 years ago, I would have liked to have thought, hey, we're making a total hash of our COVID response, but we're going to learn from this. And when the next big disease comes out of, I don't know, Indonesia in 2030, we're going to knock it out of the park. We will have, come up with protocols. We'll have come up with responses. We'll have an international response, and we'll just be able to crush anything in the future. At this point, my faith in that is about zero. We can't even do it within a city, within a province, within a country, within a state. Forget an international response. But I hope you have a more hopeful message about future responses.
Actually, I do. I just think it's going to take longer. I had the same optimism you did. And especially once we discovered that COVID was airborne, it's like, okay, we've actually advanced our understanding of communicable diseases by orders of magnitude compared to the entire history of medicine, right? So we now really understand. And so it's been obviously massively frustrating to see this understanding not put into effect, right? Managing air, right? Air is the new poop, as we talked about already. Moreover, the WHO has actually really stepped on its own feet a lot. And I think it's lost a lot of credibility. The WHO does a lot of amazing work, but where they have been really visible, they have failed badly. And it started with them saying, hey, we're a global organization and we don't want to see globalization threatened. So everyone should just keep on flying and traveling and everything will be fine. And from that point onward, I think they caused a lot more harm than they've avoided. So you've got a lot of cynicism. We also have a very, very empowered anti-protection lobby, right? Freedom convoys and other sorts of things like that. So that's a group that was, they're not on the fringe anymore, right? They're far more well organized and far better funded from I'm not quite sure where, but obviously funded. So those are big problems. But as David Fisman's pointed out, once we figured out the problem with cholera, we didn't fix it right away. It took a few years. I think it took like 7-8 years in order for those pipes to get really moved. So it was really a question of politicians need to kind of get used to it and say, is the public willing to have their tax dollars spent to do this? Or is the public demanding it? Well, people are not demanding air mitigation these days. They really aren't. And so there's not a lot of room to do that. But as things calm down, as the convoys go home, and as the pandemic settles down, which eventually it will, I hope, there might be time for cooler heads to prevail to say, now let's do it. Now let's say it's airborne. Now let's put those mitigation efforts into place. Because I think once that happens, when that new pathogen shows up, wherever it does and whatever year it does, we will be more resilient. We won't need to even rely on a coordinated international response. We won't need all of that. We won't need the WHO. We won't be as desperate for rapid vaccine development because spread will be slower simply because we're taking care of business, because we're taking care of air. And again, a natural sensibility to say everyone should own respirator masks. Just like you should have a certain amount of food and water in your house just in case, you should have a box of respirator masks so that when something shows up, there's no panic buying and everyone already knows how to wear them and everyone knows which one fits them. You slap that on for a couple of weeks. That would be a very, very easy response. It would be almost like a non-event response. That's what I'm hopeful we're going to get to. We will get to air mitigation. We will get to that, or at least I hope we do. But we're going to have to wait for the stupidity, I think, the knee-jerk stupidity of politicians to ignore. We're going to have to wait for that to dissipate.
Okay. Just to finish up here, and I should have asked you this earlier, can you make a succinct case for COVID being airborne? Because I think this is the single biggest public messaging, like you, I think this is the single biggest public messaging failure of the last year. So can you make a case for the evidence for COVID being airborne? Go.
Sure. I'll make it in two ways. One is we've always known that measles is airborne, and measles is enormously contagious. Okay. And COVID looks like measles. It's a round ball with spikes. Morphologically, they're very, very, very similar. So how is it that two things that look exactly the same are airborne? One is airborne, one is not. We consider tuberculosis to be airborne because it's been with us for a long time, even though it's not nearly as infectious. So we have a lot of our historical knowledge of respiratory viruses are droplet and measles and tuberculosis are airborne. It's all based on history. It's not based on evidence. But the fact of the matter is COVID behaves a lot like measles does. And so my other part of my argument is the idea of a super spreader event. Droplet transmission cannot be spread with super spreader events. That requires airborne transmission, unless you're at an orgy where everyone's really, really, really close. For a super spreader event to happen in a room, as we have seen it happen since March 2020 with that choir in Washington State, that has to have been airborne because they just weren't close enough to each other. So if we had no super spreader events, if COVID was not very contagious, I would have a hard time making that case. But it's massively contagious, far more so than droplet would actually allow us to believe. And the fact that super spreader events exist is really it. Remember, most people who get COVID give it to nobody. But some people who get COVID give it to dozens or hundreds. And that has to be airborne. That to me, that's the smoking gun right there.
Okay. So when you say airborne, do you mean actual viral particles floating through the air? Or are we talking about aerosols, which are smaller than droplets, but bigger, much bigger than the actual virus particles?
When you exhale, you exhale a lot of water vapor, and those viral particles are hitching a ride on water vapor, and those particles can be at the same time small and large, right? So you're exhaling a whole wide range, and I think it makes sense to stop talking about the difference between large droplets and aerosols. There's virus coming out in droplets, and the smaller ones float, and when the air is dry, those droplets evaporate, and what's left is that floating virus. So when you're inhaling, if you go into a room where there's COVID, you're inhaling droplets, you're inhaling aerosols, you're inhaling viral particles that have lost their droplet through evaporation. You're inhaling all of those things. And trying to draw distinctions between them, I think, misses the point. It's floating in the air and you inhale it, and respirator masks are fantastic at trapping those small particles.
Excellent. So we're left with respirator masks, we're left with filtration, and we're left with ventilation and possibly carbon monoxide, or not carbon monoxide monitoring, carbon dioxide, CO2 monitoring.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, those are our big tools, and we should use them.
Okay. So if people want to follow what you're posting about this, how do they do it?
Well, I chat on Twitter. I used to actually speak in the media quite a bit, but because apparently we don't have a pandemic, that's gotten really quiet. And on one hand, I'm actually really happy that I've got a little bit of my life back. It's not fun. It's very stressful. I'm enjoying our conversation, you and me now, but to sort of have 10 or 12 of these a day can be really, really brutal. So I'm personally liking the quiet, but it's actually making me anxious because it means there's just much less discourse going on. So I've got far fewer ways to talk about this stuff publicly, and I think it's concerning because the conversation shouldn't be over because the pandemic's not over. So I'm on Twitter. And these days I've been kind of quiet because of the election, and it's really hard to talk about this without actually talking about that. And I'm not a political scientist, and I don't really want to be branded as a hack. So we're in a very awkward space in Ontario right now. But that's the following me on Twitter is certainly one way. And there's a lot of really smart people. Look at who I follow. I follow some really smart people. There multiple voices are needed. Multiple professions are needed. We need engineers to speak up. They are. We need physicians to speak up. They are. We need other epidemiologists. I don't always agree with them. They don't always agree with me. But when you have that multitude of voices and perspectives, what you actually find is convergence. So I'm only one voice. I think that's really important too.
And on Twitter, you would be
I'm at Furness Colin.
Furness Colin.
You have an extraneous E. Furness.
I apologize.
Yeah, no worries. I'm Googleable. Let's say.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and hopefully in another year's time we can get together and talk about the great success that the anti-Omicron and the universal coronavirus vaccine has done, and we'll reminisce about the bad old days.
I worry it may take more than a year, but I'd be happy to check in with you in a year and see where we're at.